In traditional Catholic circles, there is a story that has made the rounds for many decades now, one that has been little better than a rumor, about the origins of the Novus Ordo Missae, the new Mass, often insultingly called the ordinary form of the Mass. And that story is that it was assembled by a committee dominated by Protestants and chaired by a secret member of the Stonecutter sect, which at the time incurred automatic excommunication if you were a member of such an organization. Now, that committee is factual, but the identity, that was up for debate. And this story, while intriguing, was just that, a story, one that we could not really prove. We had hearsay, compelling hearsay, including stories of this cardinal that we're talking about being banished to the literal desert by Pope Paul VI when he found out that it was true, but the evidence was left to the realm of the anecdotal. As a consequence, this story has been mocked as a conspiracy theory by those who defend the new Mass and the new order of things in the Church and try to undermine the movement to restore the traditional ancient Latin liturgy. Now things have changed. While everyone was distracted by the fact that Archbishop Vigano and the auxiliary bishop from Kazakhstan have reacted in a rather heavy way to the Pope's new encyclical, a story was released online that provides evidence, personal testimony from someone who occupied a position that the powerful often ignore, and as a consequence, witness things that others should not have had. And then that story has been corroborated by those with very credible positions in the hierarchy from decades gone. All have since gone on to their judgment. In other words, though, we have the testimony, and that has been confirmed, of a pious Catholic woman with a lifetime of service that Cardinal Annibale Bugnini was in fact a member of the Stonecutters, and it's been corroborated by now long since departed members of the hierarchy. Let's get into this story. I'm going to begin with this disclaimer, which I will quote from the Society of St. Pius X's website on the topic of the new Mass. Quote, "A criticism of the new rite cannot be a criticism of the Mass in itself, for this is the very sacrifice of our Lord bequeathed to his Church, but it is an examination, whether it is a fit rite for embodying and enacting this august sacrifice." End quote. In other words, I am not critiquing the Mass as the Mass itself. I'm not critiquing the Mass qua the Mass, because the Mass is the most awesome and awe-inspiring event on earth when you understand what it is you are witnessing, and it happens every hour of every day, in a constant offering to God the Father. That is not what I am doing here. Rather, I am examining the origins of the new Mass in light of the evidence that emerged in the form of the discovery of the testimony of the pious Catholic woman who served for 41 years as Pius XII's personal housekeeper, and the implications that it has due to its corroboration. And she served in similar roles for the subsequent popes until she was too old to serve anymore. The woman in question, Mother Pascalina Leonard, was a nun who devoted her life to the Church. She passed in 1983, and may she rest in the beatific vision. She is described by Peter Kwasniewski, who writes for LifeSite News, among other places, and he does so in the following way here. Quote, "She was Eugenio Pacelli's housekeeper for 41 years. From his time as papal nuncio in Germany in the 1920s through his papal reign as Pius XII until his death in 1958. In the interview, Moore discusses a long number of personalities, including Pius XII, John the 23rd, Paul VI, John Paul II, and particularly Annibale Bugnini, as well as Vatican II, the liturgical reform, the infiltration of stonecutters into the Vatican, and of course Fatima. Father Murr divulges what he saw or heard from the very people involved, including cardinals who discovered their connections of high-ranking prelates." End quote. Kwasniewski goes on to give a brief background on Bugnini. I'm going to sum it up like this so you can get caught up. He served the Church for decades in various roles, including as the secretary of the Concilium for Liturgical Reform and the key figure in its execution, and had been suspected or accused of being a member of the sect. It could never be proven and had been dismissed by mainline investigators of the issue, even though trads and trad-minded folks, meaning most of my audience, tend to believe it to be true. As an example, the eminent French historian Yves Chiron, in his judicious biography of Bugnini, judged that the rumor was inadequately supported by facts, to quote Kwasniewski directly. That was until this past May, when details emerged from researchers. They came from a Father Brian Harrison, who named Cardinal Dino Staffa as the one who brought Paul VI the irrefutable proof of Bugnini's membership in that group, which at the time was rumored to be a suitcase full of actual literature. and that was the catalyst for Bugnini's dismissal. Recently, another researcher, Father Moore, offered new evidence to corroborate the story independently, and I'm going to quote Peter Kwasniewski's story at length with some interjections to break it up. Quote, Father Moore met Cardinal Gagnon in 1974. Soon the cardinal would be assigned by Paul VI to do a papal visitation of the Roman Curia, during which Moore assisted Gagnon with documents and other practical matters. Asked what the visitation concerned, Moore replies, here he quotes his source, in 1975, toward the end of his pontificate, Pope Paul VI seemed convinced, finally and thoroughly, of what he himself declared in 1972, that, quote, the smoke of Satan had entered the church, end quote. Some of the most high-ranking members of the College of Cardinals, the Pope's closest advisors, had gone to him personally and leveled some very serious accusations against key members of his own central government, that is, the Roman Curia. Very damning accusations, the consequences of which are still with us today. The Pope was so shaken by these accusations that he ordered an in-depth investigation, top to bottom, of the entire Roman Curia. He chose Gagnon for this assignment, and it lasted 3 full years. End quote. If you're not familiar with the smoke of Satan quote from Pope Paul VI, that goes like this. By June of 1972, Paul VI had grown deeply concerned that the internal unity of the Church was unraveling. Some say that he was aiming the following words of Archbishop Lefebvre, who had by this time become quite the vocal critic of the council and its consequences. The words of Paul VI are as follows, quote, we would say that through some mysterious crack, no, it's not mysterious, through some crack the smoke of Satan has entered the Church of God. There is doubt, uncertainty, problems, unrest, dissatisfaction, confrontation. The Church is no longer trusted. We trust the first pagan prophet who speaks to us in some newspaper, and we run behind him and ask him if he has the formula for true life. I repeat, doubt has entered our conscience, and it has entered through the windows that it should have been open to the light. Science. End quote. And Paul VI was actually complicit in this himself in numerous ways, but the one that comes to mind outside of the council were the speeches he gave at the UN in the 60s about the environment. Sound familiar? It should. One of the accusations that is 100% fact is that the new Mass was put together artificially by a committee. It used the liturgies of Luther and Cranmer as their inspiration, including replacing the altar with a table, the emphasis on the meal instead of the sacrifice, and emphasis on community. These are not disputed, and defenders of the new Mass say that this was done to appeal to our so-called separated brethren. Oddly, in my own experience at least, those that chose to return home came home for the Eucharist, not because they felt the new Mass was similar to what they left behind. Kwasniewski goes on, however. These accusations against Bugnini come from credible sources. Quote, Cardinals Dino Staffa, Silvio Odi, and Archbishop Giovanni Benelli. Staffa was a very powerful Curia official. At the time, he was prefect of the Apostolic Signatura, more or less the Chief Justice of the Catholic Church's Supreme Court. Silvio Cardinal Odi was another powerhouse. He later became the prefect of the Congregation for the Clergy in 1979. End quote. Which brings us to Mother Pascalina, who had been ignored by other researchers before. Quote, Bugnini stood seriously accused by Staffa, Odi, and Benelli of being a stonecutter and carrying out their designs against the Church. Bishop Gagnon and Don Mario Marini also knew about the matter. For her part, Mother Pascalina, as with most of the older and wiser personages that the researcher knew, was on the Vatican's inside track. She was close to Cardinals Ottaviani, Siri, Spellman, and to Archbishop Fulton Sheen, etc., as well as to many others around the world and in the Roman Curia. Not until some time after the Second Vatican Council did people start waking up to what Bugnini was doing, and then to what Bugnini was. Nothing of any consequence was mentioned about Monsignor Bugnini until the mid-1960s. Only after Pius XII's death and John XXIII's did Bugnini show his true colors. When Paul VI made him a bishop in 1972, people knew, or thought they knew, that he was in the Curia to stay. End quote. And yes, she was close to some of the more interesting figures, including like Spellman, who has some interesting things that have come out about him. But again, that's a story for another day. Kwasniewski, who is citing an interview here, brings attention to a question that is asked and should be obvious. If Archbishop Bugnini was somehow involved with that group, what can we say, then, about Bugnini and the conciliar liturgical reforms? We say about the new Mass? To which the answer given is this, quote, I think it is better to ask whether stonecutter designs had something to do with the liturgical reforms that Bugnini decided the Second Vatican Council desired. Were Bugnini's reforms concerned with a more perfect adoration and worship of God, or with celebrating their concept of the brotherhood of man? When certain council fathers insisted that not one word of the 1600-year-old Roman canon be touched, by any stretch of the imagination, could that be taken to mean they wanted to concoct entirely new canons? End quote. The brotherhood of man. That brings us to today, with Fratelli Tutti, which celebrates the brotherhood of man. As you know, I've expounded several times already ad nauseum, numerous stonecutter organizations have come out and publicly praised the document promulgated by Francis earlier this month. Why would they do that? It's simple, because those values in that document are their values. They belong to the sect of Satan, not to the Catholic Church. But they made a critical error. They should have kept their mouths shut. But they didn't, because a growing number of people are becoming aware of their stories that the stonecutters aren't just some wild hypothesis used to explain our current situation. Paul VI took it seriously, if far too late to do anything about it. Such is life. The question I have is this. The committee that designed the liturgy of Paul VI was comprised of at least 6, if not 8, Protestants. How many of them were stonecutters? We'll probably never know, unless someone has access to some serious connections in the halls of the stonecutters, and that would beg a lot of questions by itself. Luther famously sought to change his liturgy, to destroy belief in the real presence, to change the focus from the Eucharist to the readings of the Bible and the pastor. What we have now in far too many parishes in the Novus Ordo? A lack of belief in the Eucharist. I'll leave it at that. In times like this, we need to pray for the Church, so please do so. Thanks for listening. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.